Good morning, and just as people are arriving and joining our webinar, I wanted to welcome everyone who's already with us. So this is a webinar in a series brought to you by The Space, and today we're looking at unfair algorithms and the impact of mediated technology. I'm Linda Coburn, I'm the producer of the webinar series, so I'll just quickly talk you through what we'll do and how we work before handing over to the chair for this morning, Dr Rianna Walcott. If you don't already know The Space and the work we do, we help artists and organisations to make great art and reach new audiences digitally. We commission projects, we develop skills, and we find audiences for artworks. As you'll see from the slide, we worked extensively with arts organisations and artists across a whole range of genres, and the big part of our work is about sharing skills. So learnings from that work that we've done is what we bring to you, and that's what the webinar is part of, that aspect of what we do. And just quickly to do an overview of the timetable so you know what to expect from the session. That we have two panels, and Rihanna, our chair, she will introduce you to all of the panelists. So we started by thinking about the context, what's going on about, what the impact of unfair algorithms, and there'll be an opportunity there for questions from the audience, then a quick screen break for everybody. And in the second part, more considering, what are the responses, what's going on already, and what might happen at kind of individual and grassroots level up to kind of sector and strategy level, more time for audience questions. And on that note, we use chat a lot. So all of your questions go into chat, and Dr. Walcott will see all of those and pass them out to the panelists and draw on your questions in the discussion. So use chat to add questions, also to talk to each other. And it might be that there's other side conversations that go on at the same time, which are interesting and useful in and of themselves. We'll at 12:25 we'll ask you to do the evaluation, just because it's so important that we get that data from people, what's working, what's not working, what can we do to improve the sessions, and then we'll have a final sort of catch-up session before the end. The other practical things that are useful to know about how we work are that we have a live captioner with us today, and if live captions would be useful to you, you can go to the function at the bottom and choose which way you want to see them. And also the webinar is recorded so that it becomes available on our website for about 6 months after the event, just as another way of catching up with that information. And the other thing I want to do just before we carry on is to introduce our chair to you. As I said, it's Dr. Rianna Walcott. So Rhi, do you want to join me? So I'm delighted that Rhi's able to chair today. She's joining us from Washington, where she's at the University of Maryland as a postdoctoral associate in the Department of Communication. And her area, which is absolutely key to what we're talking about today, is researching Black British identity in social media spaces. So I'm now going to hand over to Rhi, who will introduce the panelists and set us off on our fantastic, interesting webinar. Thanks, Rhi.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this webinar today. Thank you so much for making it. Yes, we have a really interesting lineup for you today. So briefly, we have 3 panelists today. We've got Temi Lissard Anderson. If you guys wouldn't mind just popping your cameras on so I can introduce you. Yep, this is Dr. Francesca Sabant. And then last but not least, we've got Anasuya Sengupta. Okay, so these are 3 of my very dear friends, and I hope that we're going to be able to give you a wonderful overview of a really important section. And also joining us today is Fiona Morris from The Space. Hi. So today's panel, as Linda's briefly covered, is about algorithmic and tech injustice. We'll be thinking about digital inclusion. We'll be thinking about who is impacted by different algorithmic injustice and how. Who's included in when we think about digital inclusion, who's left behind, and how can we fold in the people with less access. Okay, so I've asked my three speakers to give some responses to this initial provocation. Tech injustice and digital inequalities negatively impact digital arts culture. So they'll just be responding very briefly to that. And I will kick us off, first of all, with Fiona, who's going to briefly give us the Space's understanding of this issue. So thank you very much.
Okay, so the Space's understanding of this issue, and good morning to everyone, is really, really small. I'm here as a visual representation of all of you who've also joined, because I want to hear from these guys. So I'm just going to keep this really short, because I just wanted to sort of say what the context was for this and why we reached out to Rhi and sort of started the conversation in the first place. Which is obviously, as Linda has explained, we work with artists and cultural organisations to try and help them realise what the opportunities to reach audiences online, what does it mean as an artist if you never have to be physically in the same space with your audiences? What's the opportunity to maybe break down some of those barriers that are created around geography or physical accessibility or price points, all of those things, how can publishing work online actually help you reach new audiences? And within all of that, there is obviously a great opportunity to kind of really diversify the nature of who you're talking to, the nature of the conversation. Now, we spend a lot of time talking to artists about all the barriers that are just present because the internet is a crazy, chaotic, volatile and overcrowded space. And we really try and work with them to sort of see how you can target. But there's always that danger that you end up, in fact, just super serving an existing audience that you've already been talking to. And so we've been reading things and seeing things. And obviously, there have been some amazing kind of things being written, Sophia Noble and others around kind of the algorithms of oppression, those things like that. And therefore, we sort of felt this is an area which isn't specific to the cultural sector, but it's really important that artists within this sector do understand what else might be in the way, what those invisible barriers might be, what is there. I'm not saying that anyone necessarily has any solutions to this, but we feel, and as Linda earlier said, the thing that we can do is to convene conversations, to maybe share learning, to talk about experience and actually see what we can do to lobby both at a sector level and to provide support for individual artists. That is it. Apart from that, I want to sit back and listen. So thanks very much, Rhi.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Fiona. Okay, well then after that, I'm going to kick off our speakers, beginning with Temi, if you're ready, who will be sharing some slides with us.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Perfect. Great. So, when thinking about technological injustice and inequities, I felt drawn to think through these issues in a way that allows me to consider my ongoing research. I title this short intervention, Glitches in the Machine. Our relationship to technology, and when I think about technology, I do think it's necessary to be specific. So here on after, when I say technology, what I'm discussing is social media. But I think about our relationship to social media as glitches. And I argue that the current status quo, that is our intensely mediated lives, actually wasn't part of the software roadmap. I'm not going to give Silicon Valley that much credit. Our unwitting reliance on social media is a glitch. My research explores Black women's digital intimacy. Through the lens of friendship making, I investigate how intimacies are produced and facilitated on social media, specifically Twitter. I'm interested in how our friendly, intimate behaviors are digitally mediated, and how as Black women, we navigate the different software options, user interfaces, and platform norms in their processes and in our practices of friendship. These practices of intimacy, I also argue, are glitches in the machine. I call them glitches because these platforms were not built to facilitate the kind of intimate practices that us Black women perform. The algorithmic underbelly of Twitter was developed to surveil and to extract, ultimately furthering hegemonic global capitalism. But for this paradigm to be successful, some voices, those in the margins, either need to be excluded, controlled, or they need to adhere to the homogeneity that social media platforms produce. And I'll expand on that last point just a little bit more later. So what is a glitch? Building on the work of Meredith Broussard and Legacy Russell, I suggest that glitches are a duality. They're both, quote, machinic anxiety, as Broussard would say, errors or mistakes found in software and code, but they're also an action, as Russell would say. Glitches are refusal. They're a form of reimagining technology, and they are nonconformity. This duality of glitch illustrates how inequities are both corrected in technology, but can also be resisted. Machinic anxiety is the violence of the algorithm. The algorithm decides who and what is an error. And by the algorithm, I mean we. People like you, well, not like me, but predominantly white men in Silicon Valley define and develop these algorithms. So as Joy Bellamwini found in her research on facial recognition technology, looking at those offered by Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft, she found that their algorithms were unable and unwilling to recognize her and other Black women's faces. That is, that the machine was determining Black womanhood as an error, a glitch that needs to be corrected by exclusion. Meredith Broussard says that when technology reinforces inequality, it's not just a glitch, it's a signal that we need to design or redesign our systems to create a more equitable world. And these glitches or these machinic anxieties are actually outside the control of most everyday people interacting, engaging within the digital sphere. Glitches in the dominant social media culture result in asymmetric distribution of attention, visibility, and voice. It means that what happens is an example that I think about a few weeks ago when a Black woman professor was expressing her truth about the violence of the monarchy and colonialism, and that violence that was apparently very clear that happened to her ancestors, but it ended up being censored due to the founder of Amazon, quote, retweeting her in faux indignation. It is the silencing of dissent, and it is the silencing of glitches. And so I mentioned digital intimacies and my work earlier because I wanted to make the connection between glitches and digital intimacy. Our lives are embedded and embodied in social media, and our intimate relations play out in the DMs, and some of us use dating apps to find love or other things. But there are also sites of political advocacy and resistance. They're facilitating our most intimate thoughts and refusal. And Legacy Russell says that through the digital, we make new worlds and dare to modify our own. We embrace the glitch, and that is therefore a participatory action that challenges the status quo. So if we think about the ways that algorithms breed homogeneity, and I say this in the sense that I think many of us will be aware that we've had influencer cultures who have come back and pushed back against Instagram, for example, when they say things like, my posts aren't getting as many likes and I'm being forced now to do all of my content as a reel. And so in this way, the algorithms are also a corrective measure against glitches. Digital spaces, particularly social media, are platforms for unearthing new artists and talent. They're ways of circumventing traditional processes and the structural oppressions that many marginalized people face in getting the funding, opportunities, and recognition that they deserve. But social media are also sites of refusal where people are glitching against the algorithm. And one such example of what I call glitch intimacies or glitched intimacy is the following. In 2021, Palestinians protesting the violence of Israel at Sheikh Jarrah took to social media to share their experiences because of the censorship they are facing in mainstream media. Citizens and grassroots activists took to Facebook and Instagram to share on-the-ground evidence of what they were facing, these intimate revelations of their pain and their violence. However, as SMEX, which is a Lebanese NGO that works to advance self-regulating information societies in the Arab-speaking region, they found that Facebook, now Meta, was actually censoring these efforts. And since 2019, Meta has issued approximately 950 violations against Palestinian content. And so during Sheikh Jarrah and the continued occupation of Palestine by Israel, Palestinians are fighting back with their own glitched refusal. After becoming familiar with the key words that were being detected by the algorithm, particularly in Arabic, Palestinians in social media have been circumventing the algorithm by sectioning these words or by incorporating Latin letters within them in order to avoid detection by Meta's content moderation and algorithms. And so I'll just close with a provocation or perhaps just a question for those in the audience. When we're thinking about digital arts culture and we think about tech inequities, and who you choose to platform, what type of glitches are we supporting? Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Temi. That was incredible, and I'm so excited to hear the mention of like that case study, and in particular, like I really enjoyed that last case study and thinking about avoiding detection online at a grassroots level by like introducing Latin letters in. It really reminds me of how Black people evade detection online by avoiding using terms like white and using like different letters to get around it. So that's a really interesting way of thinking about how people are already circumventing, violating moderating practices. So I'd invite everyone to sort of reflect on any of those other kinds of sort of community-derived ways of evading algorithmic injustice in case they want to chip in later. Okay, so next up, we've got Dr. Francesca Sabant, who I would like to also briefly mention has a book coming out on Friday the 6th of October, Black Oot Here, Black Lives in Scotland. And Jessica, you have to pop a link to that in the chat immediately, of course.
Thank you.
Or maybe after you finish speaking. And also, Temi, I would love if you could pop a reference to glitch feminism in the chat as well, in case anyone wants to follow up on that incredible manifesto. So yes, right, without further ado, I'm going to let Cheska respond to that publication for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, just thanks again for inviting me to be a part of today's conversation and to be in such brilliant company. I know that I'm going to learn so much and already have learned so much, including from Temi's powerful provocation. And what I'm going to share today really relates to various thoughts I've been having and writing that I've been working on over the last couple of years to do with opacity, ephemerality, and Black digital experiences. So I wanted to start by reflecting on how inclusion and visibility are often buzzwords that circulate as part of conversations concerning online inequalities, but a shift towards a focus on digital justice, power, and agency can provide a generative breakaway from a reductive and surface level focus on matters of representation, as well as potentially breaking away from stifling assumptions that it is merely forms of bias that maintain structural oppression, which can really absolve people of their responsibility to do better and to contribute to change being enacted. So I feel that understanding issues of digital justice beyond societal binaries of seen and unseen, positive and negative, and inclusion or exclusion can play an important part in ensuring that differences between people's digital experiences and lives are adequately acknowledged and understood. For example, what one person perceives as being a helpful form of inclusion may in fact be a cause of exclusion for someone else. That said, it's essential to account for the fact that choosing not to be part of a space is not always the same as being excluded. That can be an act of agency, and the absence of a person or groups of people in certain spaces, whether online or offline, is sometimes a pointed statement and an act of refusal and retreat on their part, including within the arts and cultural spaces. So what's sometimes presented as an innocuous or well-intended invitation to be included in something, perhaps an online discussion space or an in-person meeting, may at times more accurately be described as an invitation to enable forms of monitoring, surveillance, and the digital capturing of yourself or of others. I think a lot about Black angst and how it need not exist in opposition to Black joy, sort of the animating force of Black angst, recognizing who and what you care about and how that can inform decisions to refuse to participate in spaces. So put simply, inclusion and visibility are not inherently good in and of themselves. For that reason, it's vital that tech justice efforts in the world of the digital arts, culture, and beyond reflect on what meaningful forms of justice involve. And that's meaningful forms that exist outside of a preoccupation with who and what is just made public. Even this term public, it can be used in very generalizing ways which don't account for different publics that people experience, and the fact that some of those so-called publics may be closed or private in certain ways. And here the work of Dr. Rianna Walcott is highly relevant when thinking about social media spaces and thinking about how they might be set up to be private and to foster a sense of connection and intimacy. So against the backdrop of infinite digital developments and a particularly strong focus on digital tech during the pandemic, expressions such as always on, going viral, and representation matters have become synonymous with digital culture, including its central and often invasive role in many people's lives. I say this as someone who makes use of digital technology and social media. I'm on Twitter, so I'm not pretending to be above or beyond engaging with all of this, but I think that doesn't mean we can't still think critically while making use of the platforms and the spaces that are available. We've seen words such as amplify, promote, and platform heavily feature amid institutions' claims to care and as part of their equality, diversity, and inclusion efforts. As Marcel Rosa Salas and I argue in our recent article, we're witnessing the commodification of identity politics and the marketization of intersectionality, which many people have commented on. This includes examples such as organizations mistakenly equating expressions of visibility, hypervisibility, and visual representation with substantially tackling issues of injustice. So by engaging with and respecting forms of opacity, I argue, namely the various ways that people intentionally avoid forms of visibility and publicness, there is the possibility of understanding aspects of digital justice that move beyond a limiting preoccupation with representation, searchability, and visibility. By reflecting on opacity, there is also the prospect of parsing different perceptions and experiences of publicness and privacy, which connects to questions to do with ethics and the arts, both online and offline. I also feel that thinking about these issues can involve thinking about how terms such as mainstream and mass publics are often mobilized as though they are at the center of everyone's lives. Not every individual wants their work or who they are to be available, to be public to all. And what does that mean for the arts and culture spaces in terms of supporting the work of different creatives, artists, and individuals? Even when choosing to participate in certain public spaces, some individuals make careful decisions about which public spaces they want to be part of, what sort of audience they want to communicate with or be in community with, and who or what they might want to avoid. In the incisive words of Moya Bailey, visibility can be reactionary or generative digital alchemy, depending on how it's leveraged. So drawing on Bailey's extensive work on misogynoir, Black feminism, and digital alchemy, along with Glissant's Poetics of Relation and Salter's body of art and work on Black women's lives, I've been exploring how forms of Black feminist opacity occur in ways that play with the possibilities of reclaiming, retreating, releasing, and returning. This has included spending years researching aspects of digital remix culture, including how the affordances of different technologies, platforms, elements of digital culture are fruitfully remixed in ways that aid forms of opacity and online elusiveness. Especially shaped by vital work on digital Black feminism, including Catherine Knight-Steele's landmark book on this topic, I've been thinking about how Black feminist efforts to bypass visibility and capturing forms of recognition are not just parts of strategies to subvert market logics. It's not just about a refusal in some cases to pander to pressures to self-brand or demands to forge a digital presence. Instead, this is part of practices to pursue personal peace and well-being in ways that honor boundaries and both their fluidity and rigidity. So focusing on examples of Black feminist digital disengagement, witnessing, and ephemerality, I've been considering the relationship between Black feminist opacity and efforts to protect peace, which is not always the same as privacy. Certainly, Black feminist opacity doesn't depend on the affordances of digital platforms. Still, it's necessary to acknowledge that elements of digital culture, including remixing practices such as meme culture, can be part of how Black feminists engage in the work of opacity, including with regards to creative and artistic work. Therefore, opacity is not just about moving away from digital spaces, it's also about retreating or finding refuge in them as well. Overall, to me, from the creation and deletion of closed social media groups to the offline archiving of ephemeral online communities, Black feminists have been remixing digital processes, platforms, and possibilities for years. But acknowledging and reflecting on aspects of this should not be mistaken for a willingness to dissect Black opacity, Black digital feminism, or Black angst. After all, it's opaque and it should remain so. Thanks very much for listening to me, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with everyone.
Thank you so much, Cheska. Sorry, I'm just trying to get your article on the digital remix, the Black Feminist Remix Lab in the chat right away. Thank you so much for that. A lot of really rich content there as well. And thank you for the cheeky shout out as well. So last but not least, we've got Anasuya to talk to us a little bit more about these, following up this same provocation. Yeah, cheers, Temi, for popping that in the chat as well. Yes, digital archivist in the background. So yes, please take it away.
Can I just say what a joy it is to be on this panel with friends and inspirations, and Temi and Francesca, you've already just done such an extraordinary job of problematizing everything we take for granted in the digital sphere. I want to pull out two really particular things that both of you said that is so important. One, Francesca, around this extremely problematic notion of inclusion and representation at Whose Knowledge, which is a feminist collective of scholars, activists, and artists who are Black and brown women from and in the global South. For us, we often point out that inclusion almost automatically means that you are at the center and including others. So who is at the center is always a question. So for us, when we think of our work at the intersections of knowledge and tech justice, very much for us, we move to the notion of justice rather than representation, because for us, we are centering the leadership, the design, the imaginations of those of us who have been historically and continue to be ongoing, marginalized by power and privilege structures and processes of power and privilege. And of course, by marginalized, I just want to point out that we are marginalized by the global majority. And that is often something we do not recognize, and especially in digital infrastructures. And here I'm going to talk more broadly about the internet as a whole, from the back end to the front end of the internet, from the design and architecture of the internet to the user experience that we all have being on social media platforms or looking at content online. The internet is so strongly a hegemonic set of structures. And just to point out that at this point in time, nearly 70% of the world is digitally connected, most of us through the mobile phone. 3/4 of those are from the global South, from Asia, Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, and Pacific Islands, and of course, Black and brown diasporas from around the world. Nearly 48% of all women are online, and yet the internet does not get produced through us and for us and by us and with us. And that is the difference between thinking simply about representation and thinking about justice, as both Temi and Francesca have pointed out. And in that production, it's really important to think about the political economies of where this is coming from. So to Temi's point about Professor Anya, whose Twitter feed and tweet was censored on the Biafran War at when the Queen died, and her tweet about colonialism and the role of the British monarchy in that. The reason that she was on Jeff Bezos's radar was because she had tweeted about support to labor organizing within Amazon, right? She had tweeted a photograph of her with a labor organizer from Amazon. So remembering that this virtual production in the cloud is heavily predicated on the political economies of who has power and who controls internet infrastructures is really important for all of us who are content producers online, because we mustn't, or I think we have to be careful about recognizing that, just as Francesca said, we all use the internet and we find solidarity on the internet. We also have to recognize these underlying powers. 5 companies, tech companies, literally have control over all of the infrastructure that we use today. Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. 2 of them, Amazon and Microsoft, hold the majority of the storage, the cloud storage. All of us, wherever we are on the internet, store our content on either Amazon cloud services or Microsoft's cloud services. So just recognizing this form of incredibly hegemonic power is very important for us, including as artists. And just also to think about artists as knowledge producers, because we are, I think, some of the most evocative knowledge producers. What is knowledge online is also a question for us to ask. And again, I do want to problematize this, just as Francesca has said. At the same time, there is a recognition that even if we want to produce knowledge, we do not either have access or we cannot produce knowledge in the ways we want to. Either we are in hyper open environments, for instance, with folks who don't want their knowledge online and are forced to have their knowledge online, or we are in hyper invisibilized and undermined spaces where even the knowledges we do want to wish to have online are not. And so just as a reminder, what we produce offline and online are in a continuum. So if we look at knowledge producers just in the UK, out of 21,000 professors, 25 Black women are full professors. And you have 2 of them on this panel, and 1 soon to be. It's a frightening and really horrific statistic to think about the world of knowledge being produced with such a thin slice of humanity, of white, straight men from Europe and North America, basically. I've just been in Lusaka, Zambia, with a whole host of extraordinary African feminists talking about decolonizing the internet. And one of the things we discovered together was that of all the knowledge production in the world, 1 to 2% is produced from Africa. 85% of the research on Africa is produced from outside Africa. When even we think about Black diasporas, Brazil has the largest Black diaspora of enslaved peoples in the world. And yet we do not see the knowledge production from Brazil. We do not see the artists of Brazil. We do not think about the Black imagination from Brazil in a way that should be centered. Why is that? So whose leadership, whose design, whose architecture, whose imaginations, whose creativity are really centered in the production of knowledge, of expression, of art, of the internet itself? And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Anasuya. I've got absolutely pages of notes about all of you guys, and I could not have asked for better responses to that provocation. That was wonderful. Thank you again. So I'm going to take this moment to remind the audience that this is a prime time to pop any questions that you have in the chat for our panelists. You know, the rest of this is going to be a very open discussion between all of us who have such wonderfully complementary and overlapping work and ethics and praxis. So I'm really, really excited to get this conversation going. And the same thing goes to you 3, Cheska, Anasuya, and Temi. If you have any questions for each other or anything that you'd like to direct at each other, I really loved how, you know, as we moved through your talks, you all began to start talking to each other's work very naturally, which is, you know, always such a delight for a chair to see. Okay, so yes, just if you have any questions to any of our audience, please do pop those in the chat and I will be keeping an eye on that. But I will start by going right back to Temi and your wonderful work on, you know, on introduction to glitch feminism and your work on Black women's digital intimacy online. So just as a recap for anyone here, oh, first of all, we've got a question. Cheska, will Black Oat here be available as an audiobook?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. So it's not being released as an audiobook when it's out on the 6th this week, but we've got hopes to record audio as part of it. And we're also actually working on various plans to do with visual culture and some sort of a graphic novel to accompany it, and Scott's translations of excerpts too. So basically, we're going to be doing some audio and we're going to be finding different ways to share it in different formats. And thanks for the question.
That's really cool. Okay, very much looking forward to that. So, Temi, you mentioned, you were talking about glitch as machinic anxiety as well as a politic of refusal, which then obviously dovetailed really nicely into Cheska's talk about refusal and the different publics online who may or may not want their work to be hyper visible in a way that, again, Anasuya referenced, the tension between hyper visibility and hyper invisibility. So just thinking about what all three of those things share, our thoughts about inclusion and visibility as not being the inherent end goal, and the fact that we are talking about this in an arts organizational context. What I'd like you all just to, if anyone has any thoughts on how can an organization like the Space think about avoiding the commodification of identity politics and avoid thinking about inclusion and visibility as an end goal. What can we expect or hope from either sector responses, organizational responses, or our own responses that allows for us to to move beyond that idea of visibility as the end goal. Would anyone like to come in on that?
I can try.
I'm going to
sharing some initial thoughts, very initial thoughts. But I think I'd love to hear more. This is a question I've got, but I feel like it could connect to this. I'd love to hear more about Temi's work in glitched intimacy. And I guess I was thinking about that in relation to the sector and just what it means when organizations might assume that everybody wants to experience the same extent of publicness or visibility. Organizations might, in a well-meaning way, share photos or tag an artist into different social media posts without thinking about what they might be exposing them to and whether or not that's actually aligned with how the individual wants to share their creative work and art. And yeah, I was just thinking of what Temi was speaking about to do with glitched intimacy and just her work as well as your own work on Black intimacy in different digital spaces and how organizations can be respectful and mindful of it without trying to co-opt or capture it.
So it's like even the idea that potential platforming can expose people to different circles. Some of my work thinking about the nature of the public and the different types of public. So just as a very brief reference, I use, oh my God, I've forgotten her name now. Black Publics. Catherine Squires, gang. Yeah, Catherine Squires' 2002 work on Black digital publics, which talks about publics as, moving between, yes, enclaves versus counter publics versus satellite publics. And one of the things that my thesis looks at is about the adaptiveness of different publics. So thinking about how a public might change its allegiance, might change its needs for visibility, might at one moment want to be discussing with other publics on a global scale, and at other moments might want to have a more enclaved relationship where they're only talking to each other, keeping it in-house. And I think that idea of keeping topics in-house is so important for marginalized communities who, when being brought out onto wider forms of visibility, might be put in danger, might be very aware about the optics of monitoring and surveillance, might want to keep certain aspects of joy and angst inside of, there's a space for revelry. So again, to tie it back to, that conversation that Anasuya mentioned with Professor Anya, whose tweet about the Queen's death and about the relationship that she as a person from the Black diaspora has to monarchy did not match the tone of the national grieving and, led to her being singled out by Jeff Bezos, one of the heads of one of those massive hegemonic internet powers that we're talking about here. So that's I think a prime example of how a conversation that is, meant for the eyes of people who understand it, meant for the eyes of, of a specific Twitter circle, can be made hyper visible and be, suffer from context collapse and be made visible to an audience who may not be as compassionate. So, I mean, just trying to, there's obviously the reverse of that where we've got shadow banning. And I don't think anyone mentioned the actual term shadow banning, but it is one of the texts that I sent out an article for, that I recommend everyone read. It's a wonderful article by a dear friend of mine, Paula Akpan, who wrote about shadow banning and algorithmic injustice on Instagram and the communities it disproportionately affects. So of course, we've all been talking about, the global majority as people who are disproportionately affected by internet injustice. But of course, that also expands to thinking about people who have less access, who, perhaps don't have less access to digital works, or people who are, like women's lack of, 48% of women are online, but the internet not being produced with us in mind. Okay, I can see that there's a question in here. What would be our thoughts on how visual artists can incorporate more choice of how visible their work is given, so that, oh wait, sorry, one more time. How can visual artists incorporate more choice in how visible their work is, given that so much of sharing art online is difficult to boundary? That's a really great question. And I think it calls, to me, it speaks to that, that continuum, the fact that you might want it to be incredibly visible to some, not visible to others at all. Like, how do we navigate, the changing boundaries of where we want our work to be seen, where perhaps the same piece of work might look different in different times. So, we regularly hear about how following a death is not the right time to talk about colonialism and so on. But perhaps, a tweet like Professor Anya's might have slapped a week later, it might not have been a problem for people online in that moment. But a lot of people want to do, national mourning and all that. So, Temi,
yeah,
go ahead.
I think I have thoughts about the question asked, and also about President Anya's tweet, in that I think about it through a lens of power as well. Obviously, that power is implicit there, but explicitly in the sense of visibility. Jeff Bezos retweeting knew that would gain more visibility of her tweet, even though Professor Anya is a verified Twitter user, I believe, which means that she has a level of increased reach and scalability because Twitter has identified her as someone noteworthy, or someone who be followed, essentially. That power was weaponized in terms of that scalability and reach by Jeff Bezos, and he knew that it would increase more let's say, impressions to her tweet, which is why I called it, I think, thank you, Anasuya, for providing that additional context, faux indignation, because there were personal issues at play there as to why he found it important to retweet that. And going on to the question about visual artists incorporating more choice, unfortunately, I think if you want to have more choice, you have to come off social media, because as I mentioned, you don't have that choice around the algorithmic underbelly. There's a couple of artists I follow on Instagram who talk a lot about the fact that, one day you're the cock of the walk and the next day you're not. And it really depends on the whims and the whimsies of white men in Silicon Valley as to whether or not you're the flavor of the month that month. And so some ways, as I mentioned, that people have been trying to resist against being seen as a glitch, as in the machinic anxiety, is by incorporating more resistance through the algorithms. So using coded language, keeping in-group knowledge in group, or as Rhi says, keeping topics in-house. But I think what we also have to think about is how that minimizes the reach of their work. And oftentimes artists are sometimes starving artists. And so if you don't have that reach on social media, then you're not going to get your work commissioned, or you're not going to get your products bought. And so I think it becomes this vexed position where you need the platforms for the reach, but you also maybe don't want the platforms for the reach because of the hate that might come back of you expressing your particular type of art. And I think that connects it for me to another point. If there's any people on this webinar who are in the position to be able to platform specific artists, I think it's about allowing them the space to develop the type of art they want to, without any sort of preconceived notions about respectability politics or wanting to offend funders, because we all know that these institutions are often funded by wealthy old white men philanthropists who have their own political ideologies. But it's important to note that you can't want to make use of the radicalism of Black and Brown people and their expressive art in one way, and at the same time want to restrict the ways that they want to express their visual, express their visual intimacies in a way.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think just before, because we are going to take a brief 5-minute break before we come back and continue this conversation. So in that time, please do continue to pop any questions or thoughts you might have in the chat, and we will return to them. I guess the only thing that I'm thinking about in terms of that last question about visibility is the very bones part, obviously Temi's mentioned that there are ways that artists might navigate, possibly linguistically navigate keeping topics in-house by, thinking about the literal signs and symbols of how we use social media and the language that we use to avoid visibility and being picked up in certain ways. But there's also, I think I want to return to what Cheska mentioned about Bailey's Misogynoir Transformed and that concept of generative and defensive alchemy again, and the ways that users online and different publics might work in a way that is either generative, creating new opportunities and spaces online via certain, manipulations of digital spaces, or defensive, which is where we might respond to danger online via those same things. And one of the things that I think is really important about that configuration of alchemy is the idea that the users themselves have some agency in creating these different spaces. So it might be that you might do this in a way that either work with platform affordances or against it. So, we're constantly seeing updates to our social media platforms that kind of make them a little bit more similar to each other. So, thinking about Instagram's ability to put stuff on your story for everyone or stuff on your story for your close friends. And then we had fleets, and now we've got Twitter circles, and, being able to limit, yes, algorithmic homogeneity, thank you. And being able to limit who can respond to your work as well on Twitter, only your followers can respond and reply and so on. So there are, certain ways that people are, we see platforms recognizing perhaps these different things that users need in different ways. But then we also see users carving out their own spaces. Everyone has a group chat these days. People have alts. People have private Twitters, people have Finsters, that's a way of reacting against the sort of visibility and keeping yourself safe. Okay, I have rushed over our break.
Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
I was just going to add something around agency and consent for artists, because I think it's important as we talk about these issues also to offer people a few practical ways in which to think about how they navigate this continuum between the hypervisibility and the hyperinvisibility, and make their own choices, as you said, in a way, make their own choices at different moments in time where they want to be and how. And part of it is keeping in mind that we think a great deal right now about sovereign data sets and sovereign data justice, which is very much about communities' own ownership of their data and data justice, as Ruha Benjamin talks about it. At the same time, because platforms are the way they are and proprietary platforms are the way they are, one of the spaces in which we do play are open platforms like Wikipedia and Wikimedia. And with all the politics of constraint and and hegemony that we've talked about already, one of the things to think about is, as an artist, you're choosing how to license your work online and where you want to see it visible, right? So part of the work we've done, for instance, is a campaign called Visible Wiki Women and Women of Colors, which is around working with artists, scholars, academics of different kinds, community organizers, women and non-binary, gender diverse folks from marginalized communities, minoritized communities, to decide whether they want their work online. And if they want their work online, to understand what it means to give consent to the way that work comes online and where. So for many of us, we put our art on Instagram, but that art could disappear in a second. It could be used in a second. It could be co-opted in a second. And it isn't that putting it on something like Flickr or Wikimedia Commons is a better option necessarily for the way it might be co-opted or used, but your own intentionality is archived in the way that you bring them onto those platforms. And these are platforms that don't have ads, they're not proprietary. And you can choose the licensing. For instance, with Flickr, you could choose to make your license open but non-commercial, which is that your work could come online to be openly shared, to be attributed, but not to have any commercial purpose, not to be used for profit. On Wikimedia, we are still fighting that fight, but when you share something on Wikimedia Commons, which is the multimedia repository for Wikipedia and other open knowledge sites, you essentially are saying you can share it, it has to be attributed, and it can be used for any purpose, including commercial. But for many artists, we work with two groups that are particularly working on this issue: Black Lunch Table, which is about Black artists online, and Art and Feminism, which is about artists and feminist artists online. One of the things we do very, very strongly is to work with them to think through what it means to be online with as much power, agency, and consent as you can be. And I think that's really important as we talk about the ways in which we want to be online safely, securely, joyfully, and of our own choice in the communities we want to be. So I just wanted to offer some of that, because as artists, I know artists are constantly thinking about how and why. And so that too is a choice about when to bring your work online and where.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's, opened up some really gorgeous conversations about politics of citation and things like that, which, we've discussed before in the past. I am going to, let's take a 5-minute access break. So we'll be back on the hour. And I think that, during that time, if you do have any questions, take some time to ruminate on them, and please do feel free to come back and pop those in the chat. We'll be back and doing much more of the same sort of open conversational panel. And yeah, I'm happy to feed your questions to our wonderful experts here. Okay, I'll see you all in 5. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Hey. Okay. Hello, hello. So we've got a question to kick us off. So I had a question from Lisa about a very practical level. If we're thinking about talking about the work of Black artists, in particular, perhaps for moments like Black History Month, which we've just entered in the UK, what questions should we be asking ourselves before we do this? Anyone want to come in on that? Like, what kinds of questions should we ask ourselves when we are, on a very practical level for, the space and the kinds of work, promotional work that they do here? What kinds of questions should we be thinking about?
I think, so there are lots of different questions. I guess that the first question or thought that comes to mind is, I know it's not always the case, but certainly with some approaches to Black History Month, I think that with certain organizations, what becomes clear is that it's treated as an afterthought. So there's not any sense of sort of long-term planning or pacing, actually. And this is me thinking in particular about Black chronically ill and disabled artists who are asked to do things last minute with a very small or non-existent budget, or with a budget which isn't clarified up front. So I suppose some of the questions that come to mind for me is, why is it that the organization wants to do something during Black History Month, beyond the fact it's Black History Month? So what's the intention or what's the hope? And how will what's being planned be part of a longer term commitment to supporting the work of Black artists? I think also thinking about who might be approached. Sometimes it tends to be fairly well-established individuals who already have access to the sort of funds or institutional forms of support that helps them to sustain their practice, who are invited to things by different institutions. And it's not to say that, they can't be a part of what's going on, but I think it's unfortunate if the individuals who are really in need of the sort of support that organizations can offer aren't the ones typically who are approached. And then other questions include, how's this activity going to be shared? Will there be an online component, an offline component? The sorts of matters that have already been brought up. So how does this individual want their work to be made public? Do they want it to be made public? How is their creative practice going to be supported beyond a one-off event or one-off moment? So that's lots of questions in response to the question, but I think I'm always focused on, when it comes to Black History Month, how also do organizations uphold respectability politics? So it's often an individual who's perceived as the exceptional, so-called respectable Black person who is invited to participate in something, and that's sometimes because they're going to uphold the status quo, the predominantly white middle class cis heteronormative status quo of an organization. So yeah, how are organizations going to make changes and contribute to action that isn't simply about a marketing or public relations exercise? And how can they ensure that chronically ill and disabled Black artists are at the forefront of these activities, as opposed to often being an afterthought, if not being entirely excluded?
Fantastic, thank you very much. I think, like, on a very basic note as well, why not invite someone in November? Because I think as a, and in September, because I think as a, a Black person who tends to make the majority of their income in October, sometimes I think it hurts a little bit when the invitations dry up so suddenly before and after. And yeah, I think sometimes different points of the year would really make your artists feel genuinely supported, as opposed to, asking us to buy into our own tokenization, which is really hard. Okay, Temi, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I just wanted to really quickly add onto both of those points, that when thinking about Black artists, how are you defining artists? To Francesca's point, a lot of these people who tend to be platformed do have the experience, and that often comes out of the forms of privilege of having gone to art school, for example. So just extending that definition of artists, I think, and also being more inclusive of other people who might have different experiences and backgrounds, but have turned to art as a way of expression. I think that's incredibly important, particularly in Black History Month, and thinking about contemporary and future histories of Black people in the UK.
Wonderful, absolutely.
Sorry.
Yes, please do, please.
I was just going to add that to both Temi and Francesca's point, I think all of us around Black History Month and months of the kind need to wear a second skin of discomfort. And that discomfort is what needs to hold us accountable to the ways that we show intention and practice, because we can say all sorts of fancy words around why we are doing what we're doing. But as Francesca and Temi both pointed out, there's huge co-optation and commodification of these months, and they can be very extractive rather than actually transformative. And so to be really careful about proximity politics as well, doing what comes easy, right? Push yourselves, ask where you have not asked before, go where you have not gone before, invite people who will make you uncomfortable, I think is really, really important. And then, as you both said, and all three of you said, ask the artists how they would like to represent themselves rather than presume.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Oh, Cheska has dropped an absolutely, an old one of mine. Oh my God, the 8-year dig up. Thank you so much. Yeah, a very old article that I wrote about Black History Month and, you know, the how we can move beyond just circulating tropes. Okay, I see another question in here that has drawn on some Audre Lorde, which I think is very timely and appropriate. If, as Audre Lorde said, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, what are the panelists' thoughts on AI, and machine learning, who and how it is coded and controlled? And of course, we've already started to talk a little bit about global hegemonies and those, 5 tech companies that control all of our infrastructure, and the 2 that control the everywhere that we store data. So I think, yeah, that's a really wonderful question to pose to us. And I think I just want to complicate this question ever so slightly by bringing in those 3 levels that we're thinking about in terms of the sector response, you know, possibly, you know, Temi, I know that you've done some work on policy, sorry to draw you out like that, and, you know, tech policy, and then also thinking about grassroots levels. So, you know, at this point where we're thinking about, you know, who and how are in charge of the sort of tech injustices that we're facing, how can we respond to those at those different levels? I'm going to go to Temi first of all, because I've already drawn it out in her name, because I know that Temi's done a lot of work about tech policy and digital inclusion, because that's how I met her. So let's go, Temi.
Called out. Thank you for this question. It's an incredibly large question, and I don't have enough time to give it justice. But my own personal thoughts on AI and machine learning are that they are incredibly powerful and problematic tools and technologies that are being weaponized and tested on those on the margins in numerous ways before we even see them in our feeds as forms of content moderation and content curation. And so to get more specific, within this context, I think we see the use of AI or really machine learning tools and experimentations in a couple of ways. And I know that Francesca has done some work on this, thinking about digital avatars and these fake Instagram influencers who are not actual people, but they're coded machinations of what might be an influencer. Do you know what? I've even forgotten the names because I just blocked them out. Lil Mekwi, Lil Quay, Lil something, one of those names, something like that, is coded as what I think is a particular insidious sort of, what's the word, ethnically ambiguous young woman who particularly pulls on African American vernacular in the way that they post on Instagram, and ends up getting a lot of brand deals and content deals and influencer packages to mimic or portray themselves in their proximity to Blackness that actual Black influencers do not get those opportunities. And then on the other side, we're also seeing machine learning being used to develop hyper visible, incredibly dark skin models, sort of exoticizing our melanin as sort of the ideal. And again, this sort of sense where, and again, most of these, I think, if not all of these creations are developed by white men, where they're able to define and own our embodied representations on social media platforms without actually having to engage with any Black people. And so I find that incredibly I find it disgusting, to be completely frank, but capitalism is disgusting. And so in terms of my thoughts on that, I'm not surprised, though, at the same time, that there have been investments, because we also have to think about the power behind the money and who is funding these creations. There have been investments in ways to pull from what they know is popular. And I know that Dr. Walcott has talked extensively about this in her work in terms of how Black women are cultural creators, we're cultural leaders in internet and social media culture, but we're never seen as being able to own that. I know that Francesca as well, in her brilliant book, The Digital Lives of Black Women in Britain, as well, in terms of being able to be leading the culture online, but never being able to have that same ownership or their agency or the funding put into our work. And so there's a lot of theft that happens. And so we have that on one side in terms of the cultural art sector in AI. And then on the other side, in terms of being coded and controlled, we have things like automated border control. I know in this country, it was recently, and this country is Plague Island, aka UK, where I am based, unfortunately. In this country, I feel like, I can't remember, but the Home Office recently revealed that they'll be using a tracking system, a form of machine learning, watch that new refugees and people fleeing war-torn countries that our governments have been involved in to track and ensure that these refugees are where they should be at all times. And so we're also seeing, as I said before, algorithmic control for those who are on the margins and those who are seen as an error. And so I think your question is sort of like, in terms of the master's tools, never dismantling the master's house, even though, as Cheska said, we're all proponents of the internet, we're all out here on social media, we all make use of these tools, I think it's incredibly important to assert that we can't put the same level of restrictions on people who are trying to resist and just exist within these capitalist structures. And so while they can't dismantle, what they can do is provide education and expose the ways that people are able to resist and or be controlled.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, because I think there is something inherently, especially returning to that idea about politics of refusal and refusing to either use certain spaces or, again, this the generative and defensive alchemy again idea that people of, marginalized people online are adapting these spaces in certain ways. To what point that has a radical potential, to what point that is successful, is anyone's guess. But yes, thank you so much for highlighting those things that are being done again. Cheska, Anasuya, would you like to come in on that point, or would we?
I was just ready and waiting to hear from Temi's expertise. So the only thing I wanted to add, which I was looking for the link for, is I know some people have mentioned some of these terms and some of this aspects of this discussion is new to them, but I know that Temi's been doing a brilliant job bringing together a lot of literature on race, digital humanities and internet studies. So it was just to highlight that, and again to say that for anybody who wants to find out more about this, and going to Temi's website, going to the different links that we've shared in the chat, there's a wealth of information out there. So yeah, it was just to flag that to anybody who wasn't already aware.
Yeah, also great time to do a little Twitter handle plug as well, because I know that sometimes we talk chat rec about this stuff in a much more informal way online, if you're interested at all. So guys, if you want to pop your handles in the chat, that's a good time to do that if you'd like. Weird thing to say in a in a talk like this, but yeah, handles up. Anything else, Anasuya, would you like to add?
I think part of it is for us to recognize, just as Francesca and Temi have said, that bias is not the lens. Bias is too easy a way to talk about this. This is about power in very deep structural ways. The way that algorithms and algorithmic bias are often talked about are, okay, so let's improve the data sets because you're saying the data sets are bad, or let's improve the algorithms because the algorithms are bad. It's math after all. And of course it's not. It is about deep structures of power that are influencing the ways that our offline inequities and colonial capitalist systems reflect and get reified and often exacerbated online, right? So we will never, I think, have liberatory digital presence and futures if we think about large data sets that are controlled by proprietary companies. I think this is exactly to Temi's point. This is capitalism at its worst, and it's colonial capitalism because there's no disjuncture between the two. I have to say those two words together always. And if therefore we have to resist, then we have to really start thinking about how machine learning and I try not to use the word AI for all sorts of reasons, including the fact that there's nothing intelligent about these systems. They are automated machine learning systems, augmented learning systems, and they learn through these data sets. What happens when we take control of the data sets that we want to produce and share, and how? What do sovereign data sets involve? What does sovereign machine learning look like? And I think those are some of the questions where we want to get to. One example that I'm just going to offer here, which is an example that has been very, very inspiring to many of us, is an example of a Maori community in Aotearoa, New Zealand, looking at the Maori language, which is of course a prominent indigenous language of the 6,000 plus indigenous nations in the world. And they have constructed a language translation tool and software that they have used through a community produced data set of Maori words. And both the data set and the tools are Maori community governed. They have not shared them with proprietary companies. Neither have they shared them with open source and open tech companies like Mozilla, because their point is that both proprietary companies and open source companies or free and open source software companies have had historical and ongoing structures of power and privilege that have been part of the exploitation and extraction of the Maori people and their culture and knowledge. So there's something really powerful about how we think of as Black and brown women and progressive folks going forward, including artists. What does sovereignty look like in the way that we think about data justice and algorithmic justice?
I just was going to hop in and say, first of all, I can agree more with all of that. And I just wanted to add two brief things that came to mind when you were sharing about that. And even just the overall discussion and some of the questions to do with terms too. So I feel as though there's a power, and here I'm thinking a lot about the work of Dr. Zizat Johnson to do with, there's a power in ensuring that not everything is legible. I think sometimes within different sectors, whether it's the arts, whether it's the tech space, there's this focus on open and transparency and notions of openness and transparency anyway, which aren't actually about addressing issues to do with access. It's about trying to capture, trying to consume. And there's a power in refusing to translate, refusing to pursue forms of legibility. And I'd also just like to say, I think, you know, this discussion about bias and the nonsense that can be, it's become an industry training in training to address bias. You know, we've been having these conversations for so long now, and it feels as though, to connect back to the colonialist and racial capitalist nature of society, that organizations will often find funds to try and allegedly address the sort of stuff we're speaking about, and those funds go into training that isn't necessarily training at all, and when those funds could actually go towards the artists, the creatives, the Black and brown people that they're saying they want to support. So I think a very practical thing I just wanted to mention for anybody who has, you know, a role within an organization or the power to make decisions about funds is really think twice about when funds are allocated to training in relation to addressing bias, even EDI training, because more often than not, as far as I'm concerned, that training is just an industry in and of itself, and it's more reflective of racial capitalism than it is any sort of effort to address it.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I think, so we're running up against our time, but I'm going to just, there's one more point in the chat that we've been asked to, EDI is equality, diversity and inclusion. So that's tends to be a, you know, like lots of industries and organizations have EDI departments that are, you know, supposed to be addressing issues of equality, diversity and inclusion within the industry. Okay, so yes, and I love this intentional illegibility that Oluwatosin has just popped in the chat as well. Yes, equity, yes, of course, equity, diversity and inclusion sometimes, which is, yeah, slightly better, but still bad. Right, also, so I've just scrolled back to this point by Beverly Hood. So I thought that Francesca's point that bias is not just the issue was really interesting. Bias in AI is a significant problem, but actually just reinforces and potentially magnifies and increases existing privileges and discriminations. I'd be interested to hear the panel's thoughts on this. Does anyone have, oh, and thank you for including that example from the Maori effort in New Zealand, Aotearoa. And and I also popped, last thing, I did pop a link to a book in the chat called Technically Wrong. I found it a very, like a really nice introductory read to these kinds of issues as well. It was really helpful to me and I found it really, really accessible. So I just wanted to pop that in the chat in case anyone was interested in learning more about, you know, tech and data powers online. Okay, so yeah, back to that question. I think this would be a great final reflection question for all of our panelists before we take a pause for the evaluation. So if you guys could pop the link to the evaluation in the chat, that would be really helpful. But before that, let's just respond to this last question or idea. Bias, sorry.
No, I was just going to respond to the...
Oh yeah, please go ahead, Temi. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we have covered, I think we, particularly in the last few comments, we covered sort of the problems of bias, but I think just to reinforce that, I would say bias to me within the spaces of machine learning and AI is actually a smokescreen. It is a way for the machine learning industry to present concern about these small errors in code, for example, or in data sets, and to suggest there is a productivity that is occurring in terms of debiasing these data sets. But as Anasuya just said, the data sets aren't the problem. The data sets are part of the problem, but the bigger problem is, for me anyway, like, why is machine learning being used in this space? Who is developing these data sets? For what purpose? What is the longer term corporate move here? So I mentioned Joy Bellamini, I think, in my talk, and her, I can't minimize this enough, her transformative research along with Dr. Timnit Gebru, that found these issues in the data sets for facial recognition technology that is being offered by, I think, Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft. And while there are issues, they were looking at the fact that these data sets were unable to code Black women. And so not only were they unable to recognize her face when she particularly was putting certain masks on, which is supposed to be able to identify a face, they were also recognizing them as monkeys. And so I don't know if anyone has seen the issues on Google search. If not, a really good book to read is Algorithms of Oppression by Dr. Safia Emoja-Noble, which talks about the biases, but the discrimination baked into Google search. It's part of the issue are the biases, but part of the issue is the fact that we have technology that is able to codify our faces and basically say yes or no. And then who is that technology in the power of? And then not only who is that technology in the power of, but what else do they control? And so I think, as Beverly mentions in her question, that it actually just reinforces and magnifies privileges and discriminations. When we keep talking about bias, we move further and further away from power. And I think that's part of the power of talking about bias, is that it makes you think that these things are neutral and it's just about ensuring your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed. But that's not actually the case here. And I also wanted to say, not necessarily an apology, but I wanted to note that this language is incredibly technical. And as experts on this panel, there's a level of work required to understand this language, but that's also part of the problem, in that there's gatekeeping done in technology to ensure that more and more people don't actually understand what is actually happening in our infrastructure and behind the scenes. And as part of being able to engage in the spaces that all of us do, we have to speak that same language. But that doesn't mean that it is inaccessible for everyday lay people to understand. It just means that unfortunately it takes a bit more work. But one really great documentary is Coded Bias, which I think I put in the chat, but it didn't work. And what that does is sort of outline these issues within algorithms and how they harm folks, but majority Black and brown folks, or folks of the global majority, who aren't only in the quote unquote global South, but also exist in Europe. Something I would like to point out, back to that comment actually about how do we support Black artists in Black History Month. Oftentimes in academia is so bad at this, is there'll be calls for artists from the global South, so in India and in African countries, and I'm like, hello, I'm Black and I'm here. I'm African descent and I'm right here in the UK. And so it's a way to further invisibilize the Black diaspora that exists in Europe and in North America. And so I would also encourage you to think about not only suggesting that Blackness is only further away from your home countries than it actually is.
Absolutely. And I mean, that just reminds me of a really gorgeous quote I saw on Twitter. I'm going to find it if I can, but it was about, you know, like our orientation, and, you know, it was, oh God, it's from this documentary maker in Africa who was asked about how his work communicates to Europe and the West. And he expressed that I am the sun. Why should the sun, you know, why should I as the sun turn towards the sunflower? This is my center. You know, these are the people I'm talking to. I don't care about my work being legible outside of this space. I am the sun. I just thought that was really beautiful, and I will pop that in the chat when I can. So I am going to take a brief minute now for us to just, if you wouldn't mind filling in that short feedback form. We'll be silent for a minute and then we'll be back to just do a tiny bit of a reflection. There's the chat, the feedback form is in the chat, and it would be really, really helpful if you could do that. It would just only take a minute, and it helps for the space to continue offering these sorts of webinars. Okay, fabulous. Thank you so much for filling that in. Please do feel free to continue doing that, but I just want to draw us to a close by giving a massive thank you to everyone for attending. Also a thank you to my wonderful panelists. Thank you so much for coming along. And just like some final thoughts and reflections on this. Thank you again to the space for hosting us. Special mention to our captioner, Jen Cinnamon. Thank you so much. Oh, thanks, Jessica. I'm really glad that everyone has bought 1 million books. Yes, if you do want a link to the recorded seminar or the all of the materials that we've put in the chat, please do just pop in. I'm just scrolling back up. Yes, email events@thespace.org if you'd like to receive a link to the recording and a copy of the chat with all the links. I'm sorry, I know we've been going quite quickly with throwing them in, but this is how we operate. So yes, please do continue to feel free to follow our work. It's been our pleasure to be with you today. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day.